Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun. Hey, everybody, it's Mitri Powers Mine, and this is TPIM SR Live. Welcome to the show, all. Today's date, December 14, 2019. I thought this month would be an appropriate month to give the gift of knowledge. I want to thank the confidential informant that sent me this clip to review on the show. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Without further ado, let's get into it. Another day. Another day. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
How many Americans know that Donald Trump is the president of Guam? We all grow up learning the official origin story and history of the United States. What we never learn is what this country really is, the greater United States. This is the subject of a new book by historian Daniel Emervar, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. At a time when reckoning with our history is more urgent than ever, Professor Emervar lays out through years.
And let's stop that. Why is it more urgent than ever? Because the flip-flop is happening, the paradigm shift, the way people are thinking, the way people are acting and behaving. Once again, once you become aware of the method, the end is near. Let's continue.
Of research, the true size of the American empire, how it acquired other nations and hundreds of islands as territories it still controls today, and how whiteness drew the borders of all 50 states. As the title reflects, this reality is completely hidden to those of us living on the mainland, and whatever the empire wants hidden should always be brought to light.
Welcome to the show, sisters. Peace and power. Sister Kathy, Sister Rosie. Thank the Most High y'all got up in here.
So when we first started Empire Files a couple of years ago, we were hesitant to use the word empire because it wasn't really in a mainstream lexicon at the time. And that's why it's so incredible to see your book come out, How to Hide an Empire, Daniel. Through all your extensive research, why don't we start off by talking about what makes you quantify the U.S. as an empire?
So there are a couple things that we can mean when we say empire. Empire is often used as a pejorative, and I think that's why it becomes such a contentious term. To say that the United States is an empire is to disapprove of it. But empire is a technical term. Empire is a way of referring to polities that have colonies and outposts. And in that technical sense, the United States has unambiguously been an empire. It's had overseas territories. In fact, it still has overseas territories today, and it has some 800 military bases that it has secure access to. So in that sense, just in a mere territorial sense, it's pretty indisputable. The United States is an empire.
Welcome to the show. Weird and wave dipping. Welcome. Peace and power.
Absolutely. You talk about two different maps of the United States, the logo map, which I love, and the map of the greater United States. Can you explain this difference?
Yeah, so I think when you ask most people in the United States to call to mind what they think that country looks like, they usually imagine the familiar shape. You can probably call it to mind yourself. It's the contiguous blob. Canada's on the north, Mexico's in the south. There are oceans on either side. And the thing is that familiar mental map corresponds accurately to the borders of the country for 3 years. So there are 3 years of U.S. history where that's actually what the country looks like. Partly because at the start of U.S. history, in the 18th century and going into the 19th century, the United States expanded through a series of purchases, conquests, and dispossessions of indigenous people. But also because after the United States filled out that familiar silhouette, in fact, 3 years after it did that, it started expanding overseas, and we don't always talk as much about that part. It started claiming uninhabited territory, islands.
You know, we're not going to talk about that part because we know that part would imply that perhaps the state of Hawaii didn't want to join us. Perhaps there were battleships off the coast pointing their guns at it and saying, look, King, you're going to bow down and join us. The same could be said with Guam and the other islands that we occupy. But it's for the greater good, is it not? Is it not?
In the Pacific and the Caribbean, it claimed inhabited Alaska in 1867. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had a really large and populous overseas empire. It had colonies.
And all of these territories don't really make up that much space, Daniel. Why are they so important to understand the true history of the United States?
Well, it depends. If you look at the United States at the heyday of its territorial empire, right before World War II, and you mashed all the territories together, you'd actually have quite a lot of the country. There's a lot of space outside of the United States, Alaska being the most obvious example of that.
And one obvious thing that they will never tell you on this, I guess, breakdown, the places we're talking about, the Philippines, brown people, Bikini Atolls, brown people, the Alaskans, brown people, American Samoans, brown people, Puerto Rico, brown people, Hawaii, brown people, and the list just goes on and on. Even the Thule Air Base. Look that one up, Thule, just like the Thule Society of Germany, THULE Air Base. U.S. Virgin Islands, once again, brown people. Brother Jay, Sweet Summer Child, and Too Much. Welcome to the show. Peace and power, y'all. Let's continue.
But the Philippines also is huge. And I think it might be tempting to sort of round all those islands and military bases down to zero. But what my research showed is that'd be a terrible idea, because even small spaces, even a military base in the middle of a country, that can be really important. And in fact, these spaces, these parts of the United States outside of the mainland, have consistently been on the front lines of its history. And I don't think you can really understand U.S. history unless you've got these places in view.
Before we get into this expansion outside of our logo map, let's talk about how the 50 states of the United States were captured in a very similar way to these island territories that nobody knows about. You say in your book that this massive expanse that was called, Indian Territory was really the first U.S. colony, and how that and the Louisiana Purchase defined a kind of this notion of what you called a cross-continental apartheid.
So one thing that's really important to get about the early U.S. history is how important Native American polities are to it. They are not easily displaced. And in fact, the leaders of the early republic spend a lot of time thinking about how to deal with the fact that they are ruling over a territory that they don't really have full control over, because a lot of the land still remains under Native title.
And why don't we replace that word Native with colored people? It still remains underneath colored people's title, because then I think that would piece together what they're really trying to illustrate here. And this also could potentially illustrate how far we have come from this original ideal, because the notion or the dream of America is beautiful. The United States of America, the notion of it, if it was only applied to everyone equally. So we all had a shot at gathering resources. We all have a shot at liberation. We all have a shot at personal freedom, religious freedom, and indulgences, or not. But the way it's set up now, y'all, those of us caught up in the whirlwind, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but those who are not aware of the whirlwind, the end is coming.
And so one thing that Jefferson and those following in his footsteps try to do is they try to deal with North America, or the portion of it that's the United States, by implementing a sort of continent scale apartheid. So Jefferson's vision, and this is what he wants to do with the Louisiana Purchase, is to use all that land claimed in the Louisiana Purchase, to use almost all of it for Native Americans. And the idea would be that the eastern part of the United States, east of the Appalachians, that part would be reserved largely for white settlers and their black slaves. And then the western part, that would be nearly all.
You notice how he's really quick to break down in black slaves, but he never says black folks as being the native peoples. I really, really implore y'all to check out Brother Dan Calloway's YouTube channel. Even if you're not open to the ideal, at least expose yourself to his information. And perhaps maybe do some research on your own. Let's continue.
Native American lands. And in the 1830s, the United States actually did carve up a huge part of the United States into what it called Indian country. This was land that was supposed to be lived in only by Native Americans. White people without passes weren't even allowed to go there. And at the moment it was carved out of the country, Indian country accounted for 46% of the land area of the United States. So very arguably, that's the first colony that the United States ever had, a colony in the real sense. However, it didn't last very long. Indian country was a sort of fragile presence on the map, and it was quickly whittled down as more and more areas were bitten out of it and white settlers poured in until it became what is now the state of Oklahoma.
And from the very beginning, Daniel, this wasn't a union of states. It was kind of an amalgamation of both.
Welcome to the show, Sister Love. And right on with the sub to dang.
States and territories.
Yeah, so the name of the country is the United States of America. And you might conclude from that name that it is a union of states in America. But think about what those words mean. First of all, union suggests voluntarily entered into. And a union of what? Of states. Now, it turns out that from day one, from the first day that the treaty granting the United States independence was ratified on both sides and the United States officially and legally became its own country, it wasn't just a union of states. It was an amalgam of states and territories.
Brother Tony, Brother Easy Day, peace and power. Welcome to the show.
And that's how it was on day one. That's how it is now. And that's how it's been every day in between. There's a big difference between the Western territories, which are a large part of our history books, and the overseas territories, which are too small a part of them, I feel. But even with the Western territories, it's important to recognize that they were territories and not states, and that mattered a lot. So the process outlined by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, by which the territories would become states, did something extraordinary. It laid out a pathway for these territories to become states, and if they became states, they would join the Union on equal footing as the other states. But it also made clear that they couldn't get statehood automatically. They'd have to go through a process. And when they started out, they would be under the sole jurisdiction of an appointed governor, basically a colonial governor, and some territorial judges. And this very small cadre of men, ruled the territories like despots. I mean, there's no automatic law that people in a territory get to become a state. In order to become a state, they have to win the approval of the existing states. And there's a long history of states refusing to allow territories to become states, even when they have a population that would seem to qualify them for that.
One of the most fascinating takeaways from this book, Daniel, is kind of the predication of, white nationalism and whiteness that defined states and gave the qualifications to elevate those statuses to states. Expand more on that.
Before he expands more on that, that's why. Sister Barbara, peace and power. Welcome to the show. That's why, brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico, don't hold your breath. Listen to what this man's about ready to say next, and it will be crystal clear why you haven't been afforded statehood with the millions of people in that territory as of today.
Yeah, so it's really important to recognize that white supremacy, or the rule or domination by whites, has been a really important force in U.S. history, but it hasn't just shaped lives within the United States. It's also given shape to the United States. It's decided what parts of the country become states, and it's also decided where the borders go. The prevailing logic was a logic of, do these states have a large enough white population? That's what's written into the laws that govern it, and that was the operative logic. And the reason that some territories linger in territorial status for a very long time, for example, Oklahoma, there's more than a century between the time that the majority of Oklahoma is annexed when Oklahoma becomes a state. And the reason for that is pretty transparent. The people who live in Oklahoma are, for most of this history, by and large, Native Americans. And Congress is unwilling and uninterested in admitting a state that is dominated by Native Americans.
So we only have 50 states because white people decided to colonize them the most.
Right. So, no, that's really true. The history of the statehood is the history of white settlement and the history of Congress ratifying that these areas, these territories, have enough white settlement and have enough white control to be states.
Wow, that's extremely fascinating. I mean, it's just so interesting that these states were just as captured and conquered as these other entities, but there was just enough white people to kind of validate them in that kind of cohesive logo structure that we know today.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show, Clyde. Peace and power.
No, it's really easy to sort of tell a sunny story about the continental expansion of the United States, and that sunny story is about, well, this is just a republic that's full of states and it wants to make more states. And doing that, you often paper over what's involved in conquering or purchasing lands, inhabited land that has French people, Spaniards, free blacks, and a lot of Native Americans on it, and then figuring out a way within the political frame of the United States to turn that land into something that fits into the political system, that fits as a state. And the magic dust that you kind of spread all over these territories in order to make them do that, that's white control. Your book is broken down in a couple parts, Daniel. First, there's the colonial westward expansion, and then there's the offshore territorial expansion. I wanted to see if you could briefly expand on these two phases. Yeah, so I think there's a big difference. When the United States is claiming contiguous territory, the dominant logic is that it will claim territory, ideally territory that is lightly populated enough that it can swamp those lands with white settlers. And the white population growth, the Anglo population growth in the United States is so prodigious that it's actually not that hard for the United States to take lands that have some population on them, but nevertheless send in so many white settlers that they quickly dominate the territory. And that's the logic that governs the United States throughout its 19th century history. But it looks a little different when the United States expands overseas, particularly when the United States in 1898 enters a war that Spain is already fighting with Spain's colonial subjects. Spain is in a kind of empire-wide crisis. The United States comes into that war on the side of the rebels, but then at the end of the war, it takes from Spain Puerto Rico, it takes Guam, and it takes the Philippines, as well as occupying Cuba. And suddenly, and at the same time, in a sort of imperial splurge, the United States also helps itself to Hawaii and American Samoa. And, within just a matter of years, the United States suddenly has a large populated overseas empire that it is hard to imagine that all the locals will be displaced by white settlers. And that becomes a very different kind of empire. And it requires a lot of new thinking in the United States about what to do with these spaces that don't quite look like Montana or Kansas. After the U.S. seized a large swath of territories in the Spanish-American War, it was very proud of its new status. It was bragging that, it was akin to the British Empire. It started making new maps similar to the cover of your book, Daniel, conceiving new names for the country, even pontificating whether or not to call itself Imperial America. Talk about this. Yeah, so it's kind of incredible. There's this moment of forthright imperialism where important and leading men in the country are just trumpeting the fact that the United States has, it's become a different kind of place. A lot of them see it as the adulthood of the country, the moment when it's finally reached maturity and joined the imperial club, an imperial club that is already populated by Britain, by France, and by Germany. And so what does it look like? Well, one thing it looks like is that cartographers start getting really interested in remapping the country and showing it differently. And so they issue new maps of the country that show not just the mainland, but also in insets, all the territories that are now part of the United States, which are proudly put on those maps. And it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because at no point in my education did I ever see a map that looked like the kinds of maps that were produced then, because I never saw a map of the United States that had Puerto Rico on it. I never saw a map of the United States that had Guam on it. But boy, in 1900, you could see those maps, and they were really interesting. Another thing that happened is extraordinary to me, is that writers started to wonder about the name of the country. So the official name is United States of America. Often it went by a nickname, the United States, the Union, or the Republic. These are the general ways that people had of referring to the country in the 19th century. But, after the war with Spain, after the United States had taken a lot of large populated territories, people started to wonder, are these names really the right names? Is this a union? Is this a republic? Is this a union of states? Those names didn't seem to have the same purchase. And so you can see writers casting about for variants or for new names. So the Imperial Republic is one. Greater America is one that gets used really frequently. Greater United States, that's the one that I use in the title of my book. There's a lot of variants like that. And there's also an extraordinary development. So names like Imperial Republic and Greater America, they don't stick around for that long. They sound unfamiliar to us today, but there is a shift that is important.
Welcome to the show, Sister Sandra. Peace and power.
In the 19th century, when people referred to the country, they called it the Union, they called it the Republic, and they called it the United States, but they did not often call it America. They called the people who lived in it Americans, and sometimes they called it America. After 1898 and after the war with Spain, that changes really dramatically. The first president who takes office after the war with Spain is Teddy Roosevelt. He uses America in his first annual message. He uses it left, right, and center. I found a 2-week period where he uses it in separate speeches more than every past president combined had. And after him, it's off to the races. That's just a normal way to refer to the country. And part of the reason for that switch is America is a more capacious term. America does not commit you to a political description. America doesn't say this is a union of states. America is a broader term and one that's a little easier to say in the same sentence as America is an empire.
Brett Law Rebuzz, welcome to the show. Peace and power. Glad you all got up and got in here today.
Right. I kind of wish Imperial America stuck, though, because then it would be easier to explain to people what the situation is 100 plus years later.
Republic. Yeah. One thing I should also mention with this is you can see exactly the same thing happen in songs about the country. The Battle Cry of Freedom, Yankee Doodle, Star Spangled Banner. What's interesting about all these songs is they don't mention